The mountain air was crisp that autumn morning when Jake heard the desperate pounding on his cabin door. He'd been living alone in these woods for 3 years now. Ever since the accident that took his family, the rhythmic thud of an axe against wood stopped mid-swing as he turned toward the sound. Through the window he saw her, a young woman no older than 20, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her knuckles bleeding from hammering against the rough pine door. Jake dropped the axe and rushed inside. When he opened the door, she collapsed into his arms, gasping for breath. "Please," she choked out between sobs. "They're killing my mother. You have to help us, please." Her name was Mei Lin, and through broken sentences punctuated by tears, she told him a story that made his blood run cold. She and her mother, Mrs. Chen, had come to this frontier town 6 months ago after her father died. They'd opened a small laundry service hoping to build a quiet life in America. But the settlement had changed in recent weeks. A group of men, led by a cruel ranch owner named Cutter, had been stirring up hatred against anyone who looked different. They'd started with threats, then moved to vandalism, and now, this morning, they'd gone further than ever before. May had watched through a crack in the floorboards as 5 men dragged her mother into the street, accusing her of stealing jobs, of bringing disease, of not belonging. They'd begun beating her with fists and boots while the townspeople watched, some cheering, others simply looking away. May had run, knowing the mountain man was her only hope. Everyone in town whispered about Jake Morrison, the giant of a man who lived in the hills, who wanted nothing to do with civilization. But she'd also heard other whispers about how he'd once been a lawman, how he'd stood up for the helpless, how he'd lost everything trying to protect the innocent. Jake listened, his jaw tightening with each word. He'd retreated to these mountains to escape the ugliness of men, but here it was, finding him again. He looked at May's pleading eyes and saw his own daughter's face, frozen forever at age 7 in his memory. Without a word, he strode to the corner of his cabin and pulled down a gun belt he hadn't worn in years. The leather was stiff, but the revolvers were clean and oiled. He'd maintained them out of habit, never thinking he'd need them again. He turned to May and said in a voice like gravel, "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." But May grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No," she said firmly, her fear giving way to determination. "She's my mother. I'm coming with you." Something in her voice reminded Jake of his late wife, that same steel wrapped in silk. He nodded once, handed her a rifle from the wall, and together they set out down the mountain. The 2-mile journey felt like 20. With each step, Jake felt the old anger rekindling in his chest. The fury he thought he'd buried with his family. He'd promised himself he'd never care again, never let himself be drawn into other people's battles. But some things, he realized, were deeper than promises to yourself. Some things demanded action regardless of the cost. As they approached the edge of town, they could hear it, the jeering voices, the cruel laughter, the sickening sound of violence. Jake's pace quickened despite his resolve to stay calm. They emerged from the tree line to see a circle of men surrounding a crumpled figure in the dirt. Mrs. Chen was barely moving, her hands raised weakly to protect her face. Blood stained the ground around her. Cutter stood over her, his boot raised for another kick. When Jake's voice cut through the morning air like a gunshot, "That's enough." The crowd turned as one, and Jake Morrison stepped into the street, his shadow long in the morning sun, his hand resting on his revolver. The crowd fell silent as Jake walked forward, each footstep deliberate and heavy with purpose. Cutter lowered his boot slowly, his lips curling into a sneer as recognition dawned on his face. "Well, well," he drawled. "The hermit comes down from his mountain? This ain't your concern, Morrison. Go back to your hole." Jake didn't answer. He simply walked to Mrs. Chen and knelt beside her, his large frame shielding her from the mob. Her face was swollen, barely recognizable, but her eyes flickered open when he touched her shoulder gently. "You're safe now, ma'am," he said quietly. Behind him, May rushed forward and cradled her mother's head, tears streaming down her face. The tenderness of the moment stood in stark contrast to the hatred surrounding them. Cutter spat into the dirt and stepped forward, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "You picked the wrong side, old man. There's one of you and 20 of us. You think you can play hero?" Jake stood slowly, turning to face Cutter with eyes that had seen too much death to fear it anymore. "I count 5 of you who matter," he said calmly, nodding toward Cutter and the 4 men flanking him. "The rest are just cowards who watch." His Words cut through the crowd like a blade. Several men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to the ground. Cutter's face flushed red with rage. "You sanctimonious son of a—" His hand went for his gun, but he never cleared leather. Jake's draw was faster than anyone expected, his revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed in the silence. "Don't," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of Cutter's men, a young ranch hand who'd been swept up in the mob mentality, slowly raised his hands and stepped back. "I ain't dying for this," he muttered. Another followed, then another. Cutter looked around wildly as his support crumbled, his bravado evaporating like morning dew. "You're all cowards," he screamed, but his voice cracked with fear. Jake took a step forward, his gun never wavering. "You've got two choices, Cutter. You can leave this town today and never come back, or you can face justice. Real justice, not the mob kind." The ranch owner's eyes darted from Jake to May, to the townspeople watching from windows and doorways. He could see it in their faces, the shame beginning to replace the hatred, the realization of what they'd almost been part of. With a curse, Cutter turned and stumbled toward his horse. "This ain't over," he spat over his shoulder. "It is for you," Jake replied. As Cutter rode off, Jake holstered his weapon and helped May lift her mother. An elderly shopkeeper emerged from his store with a blanket, his eyes wet with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "We're all sorry." Others came forward then, offering water, bandages, help. The spell of hatred had broken, and in its place was shame and a desperate need to make amends. Jake and May carried Mrs. Chen to the town doctor, who worked for hours to treat her wounds. She would survive, though she'd bear the scars forever. As the sun set that evening, Jake stood on the doctor's porch, preparing to return to his mountain. May came out and stood beside him. "You saved us," she said softly. "You saved more than us. You saved this town's soul." Jake shook his head. "I just reminded folks of something they'd forgotten, that we're all human, all deserving of dignity." He started to leave, but May called after him. "Will you come back? Check on us sometimes?" For the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon I will." As he walked back toward his mountain home, he realized something had changed within him. He'd built walls to keep the pain out, but those same walls had kept out hope, connection, purpose. Maybe he thought it was time to rebuild differently. Behind him, in the town he'd just saved, lights began to glow in windows. And in one of those windows, Mrs. Chen sat up in bed, her daughter beside her, both of them watching the mountain man disappear into the dusk. They were beaten but not broken, afraid but not alone. Tomorrow they would rebuild, together with a community learning to be better. And somewhere on the mountain, a hermit decided that maybe, just maybe, he could come down from his isolation and live again. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of courage, redemption, and humanity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that remind us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems against you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that one person can make a difference. Your support helps us bring you more content that matters.